Hello and welcome to another episode of Attacking Third, a CBS Sports soccer podcast. I'm Sandra Herrera, lead NWSL writer for CBS Sports, joined today as always by my colleague and co-host Lisa Roman, NWSL analyst and broadcaster. On today's episode, we're continuing our NWSL 2022 team-by-team previews. This one, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Orlando Pride ahead of the 2022 season. But before we get into all that, a quick reminder to follow us on Twitter for all breaking news at Attacking Third. If you're listening to this as a podcast, please give us a 5-star rating and review. It takes just a second and it really helps us out. And you can do that on Apple Podcasts on the 5-star/rating review page and on Spotify, on the Attacking Third page. Please give us 5 stars. It helps us out so much. Orlando Pride. Lisa, we got to talk about it. We got to talk about Orlando Pride. How are you doing today? Are you ready to get into another one of these previews?
I'm ready to get into it. I mean, this might be a tough preview for me to get through. I'm not going to lie. And we'll talk about why, but it's a different year for Orlando Pride. A lot of different players, a lot of different movements happening. Yeah, I'm excited. As I've said on a lot of our previews, I love the deep dive. I love looking at the rosters because the preseason rosters are so fun. They're lengthy, they're crazy. I'm just ready to get playing games. I'm like, let's go. Let's start the season. Let's see what these players can do on the pitch. But Orlando Pride, I mean, a lot to talk about. Sandra, are you ready?
Look, I'm more than ready. I'm here. I'm ready to talk about Orlando Pride because they have had to go through a pretty active offseason. A lot of folks with maybe a lot more questions, right, around this team instead of answers, but I'm here for it. I came prepared. I'm in my NASA hat. I got my NASA baseball cap on. I'm ready to add Astra this whole preview. Let's do it. Let's jump into this. Let me take a step back, right, for our listeners here, do a little bit of an overview before we get into the actual roster and questions there. New head coach for Orlando Pride ahead of the 2022 season. They hired Amanda Cromwell to fill the head coaching position. She's primarily a collegiate coach for many, many years, spent the last several years at UCLA for nearly a decade before switching to NWSL for her first professional season within the league. And then along the way, there were some additional hires, right? Whenever you have a new head coach, you have additional coaching staff hires that come into play. The introduction of Sam Green as an assistant, has spent 9 seasons with Cromwell at UCLA. And another one that made a lot of headlines was former United States Women's National Team star and Hall of Famer Michelle Akers returning to the sport of soccer as an assistant coach now alongside Cromwell and Green with Orlando Pride. In terms of the finish for this team in 2021, they ended with a number 8 ranking on the table out of 10 teams. And quite frankly, in our very early, way too early power rankings on Attacking Third, where we took a look at all 12 teams ahead of 2022, we did place Orlando Pride as number 12. So we're ready to take a look at how the rest of the offseason unfolded for this team and maybe finally get a chance to talk a little bit about preseason specifically. Let's maybe go through some breakout roster signings, right? Who was signed in the offseason, whether they're rookies or veterans, etc. Some moves that the team made. In light of maybe so many departures, where we'll get into that as well. But in terms of additions, they're welcoming a midfielder, Angar James from San Diego Wave, forward Darian Jenkins from Kansas City Current, defender Cecilia from OL Reign, defender Caitlin Cosme out of the draft, and then forward Leah Pruitt from OL Reign. And that's, like I said, on top of some of the biggest losses, right? So a lot of headlines around player departures, specifically for Orlando Pride. Goalkeeper Ashton Harris and Allie Krieger making their way to Gotham FC. Allie Riley also heading back to the West Coast. Jody Taylor, Alex Morgan now with San Diego Wave FC. Emily Van Egmond, who was on loan for a little bit, but will be joining the West Coast as well, I believe. And then Mia Fischel also making some waves, some news in that being selected out of the draft, but then opting to start her career in Liga MX Femenil with Tigres Femenil. And then the Pride also had to bid farewell to Phoebe McClernon, during draft week, and then also recently bid for to Taylor Korniak alongside Van Egmond. So a lot of departures here, Lisa, in the middle of maybe trying to add to build up to this team. I think when you're looking at actual breakout roster signings versus losses, I don't know if you can actually look at these two ends of the spectrum and say they cancel each other out. But what stands out to you the most, whether it's on the addition or the subtraction side of this scale?
The biggest thing that stands out to me is that Orlando is doing a lot of changes with their player personnel. When you look at the list of the losses, that's a very, very hefty list, and it's all over the pitch. A lot of other teams that we've dove in on the players that they've lost and the holes in their rosters starting for 2022, it's been secluded to an area of the field, of the pitch, and of the roster. For Orlando, it's everywhere. It's their starting goalkeeper, it's their starting center backs, it's their starting forwards, it's starting midfielders for them. It's players all over the pitch and in many different holes, and in a lot of positions that the players that are gone solidified their role in. For example, goalkeeper Ashlyn Harris, she was the go-to goalkeeper for Orlando Pride. She was their brick wall in net. She never wavered. And then also you look at up top, a forward like Alex Morgan, she started in the expansion club when Orlando Pride joined the NWSL. She had solidified her role as the striker for Orlando alongside Sydney Leroux in front of Marta. There's just a lot of big missing holes. It's also so interesting about Mia Fischel, how she was drafted to Orlando, going to play under former head coach of herself at UCLA and Amanda Cromwell from her collegiate days, and opting out of the NWSL and leaving well before the 2022 preseason even started for the NWSL. So there are a lot of holes, but the biggest thing is that it's all over the roster, and there are many different positions where there is not a starter that there was in 2021. When you look at some of the breakout roster signings, I think getting Haz James from San Diego is pretty big. Darian Jenkins from Kansas City, a player up top that can hopefully score some goals. And even Leah Pruitt from OL Reign, another forward that has had spurts and moments. But the players that Orlando signed in James Jenkins, Celia from OL Reign, Caitlin Cosme, Leah Pruitt, they are not superstars. None of them are players that can really take a team by the reins and look it in the face and say, we're going to win this thing. Lucky for OL Reign, we'll get into their current roster, but for Orlando, they do still have some of those intense players that have that personality to say, I'm going to lead this team in Sydney Leroux and in Marta. But I mean, the biggest roster signing for me, I think, is going to be Darian Jenkins or even Leah Pruitt, forwards up top that have room to grow, have the ability to have that creativity in the front line and try to just make something out of nothing at Orlando. I mean, the biggest losses, when you look at this giant list, is there one that stands out to you, Sandra? Because for me, I could pick 3 or 4 of their biggest, most detrimental losses.
No, I'm here with you. I think there's a ton that you can go through here and be like, that's a really big loss. That's a really big loss. But the one that probably sticks out to me the most is probably Ashlyn Harris, right?
Yeah.
In terms of her departure, I mean, this club made their arrival to NWSL in 2016, and they really did so in terms of building around a player like Harris, right? And kind of making her persona, her position within the team as part of a defining piece, right, of Orlando Pride in terms of team culture and such. Was the captain of this team for X amount of years. I mean, and this is a player who is a phenomenal NWSL goalkeeper. I mean, she broke a record, in terms of most saves in NWSL by a keeper. So this is somebody who absolutely was an integral part of the early days of what was Orlando Pride. So to sort of see this player go ahead and make a departure, I think was big in a lot of ways, but absolutely both positionally, right, and in terms of what a player has meant to a franchise. So I think when it comes to the goalkeeper position, frankly, there's not a shortage of those, right?
Yes.
Across the league. So it is a position that can absolutely be filled. But when we're looking at some of the additions to this one, I'm in agreement with you in that Darian Jenkins and Aaliyah Pruitt attacking players, right? Bringing attacking players into the fold was important for this Orlando Pride team, who we believe, on paper, look like they're a club that's going to be going through a bit of a rebuild, right? And we're going to get more into that. So, in terms of fleshing out certain positions that needed to be filled, right? Let's take a look at this preseason roster, right? So several players across, different lines here. Let's start with the goalkeepers. Kaylee Collins, Aaron McLeod, and Anna Morehouse listed as goalkeepers for Orlando Pride in preseason. Defenders, 9 total. Carrie Abello, Kaylin Cosme, Cecilia Jimenez Delgado, Carrie Lawrence, Megan Montefusco, Courtney Peterson, Tony Presley, Kylie Strum, and Amy Turner. Midfielders with 9, Michaela Clough, Maggie Doherty Howard, Hunger James, Gunny Johnsdaughter, Thay Rice, Parker Roberts, Erica Timrek, Viviana Villacorta, Chelsea Washington. And then for the forward core, rounding out with 8 players, and Julie Doyle, Darian Jenkins, Abby Kim, Sydney LaRue, Leah Pruitt, Jessie Scarpa, Jada Talley, and Marta, the Brazilian legend. So, looking at this roster, this preseason roster, knowing that there are going to eventually be cuts, right, as the preseason continues to go on ahead of the Challenge Cup, I think there are players that we can go through in this roster, despite so many of the departures, right, and new faces that are being introduced to the club. And there's a number of players that you can go through and say, this is probably going to be a starting 11 caliber player that we see on opening day. And when we're going through this roster, even just looking in the short term, just looking at 2021, the season we just came off of, right? There are several players that you can point to and say, this was someone who played a role in 2021. This is another player who played a role in 2021. And I think when we're looking from the top down, players who stand out there, it's a Sydney LaRue, right? These are 2 players in the attacking core that you would assume are probably going to be locks for a starting 11 should preseason go well and everybody remains healthy. And then even when you get into the midfield core, where there's probably some questions there, a player like Gunny Johnsdaughter, Erica Timrek, right? Doherty Howard, who they also acquired in a trade ahead of 2021. Players who ended up seeing time on the pitch. And you could do the same thing with defenders as well when we're looking at someone like a Courtney Peterson, right? So there's players that you can go through in this roster and maybe kind of put a pin on it and say, this is someone that we're likely going to see in a starting 11. But in terms of breaking down,
even Amy Turner, I know running through that list, like she's another one that saw a lot of time last year in 2021. We could see her slotting into that back line, an international player that really needs to step up, losing Allie Krieger and Allie Riley.
Yeah, when we're talking about this roster coming off of some of those big departures, it's like we can look and circle like this was someone who was a part of starting lineups in 2021. But there's similarly to some other rosters across the league right now, there are opportunities here across all the lines, right, for Orlando Pride, for a number of these players to probably really get in there into preseason and compete and show Amanda Cromwell, the coaching staff, that they want to compete for a spot in that starting 11. And I think a good way to maybe break this down, in that we're talking about the roster, we're talking about perhaps an ideal starting 11, but breaking this down into maybe some other areas to watch, right? When we're looking at young prospects to watch for Orlando Pride, I'm excited for this club. They have also been showing a bit of excitement in saying, hey, announcing that they are signing their young prospects to contracts, right, ahead of, or going into this preseason. And someone I'm really excited about for this team and that I want to keep an eye on is Viviana Villacorta. This is a player that they actually drafted out of the 2021 draft, right, who is just now going to be able to participate in a full preseason ahead of a full season with her NWSL club, right? So during that 2021 draft, where there was a a bit of a pandemic clause, right? Where then there for players who were declaring, they could declare for the draft or opt back into playing their final senior seasons with their collegiate teams. And while the most recent draft is probably freshest in everyone's mind, and then somebody like a player and me official getting drafted and making headlines about opting to play for Tigres, there was that storyline about the connection between UCLA and Cromwell and what they're building in Orlando Pride. So when I'm looking for young prospects to have an impact in this Orlando Pride team, it's absolutely Villa Corta for me, because this is another one of those players that you can point to and say there's that connection in terms of a player at the collegiate level already having a relationship with the coaching staff in place in Orlando. This is like a mutual relationship here where the player knows what the coaching staff is probably going to expect from them, and vice versa. The coaching staff knows that this is a type of player that they can ask X, Y, or Z from and sort of see them execute that out on the pitch. Now, she's coming off of an ACL injury, so I'm very eager to see what she looks like sort of post rehab and recovery, but she's absolutely my young prospect to keep an eye on.
I think she's a really good one to keep an eye on, because there's also not like a box that she is trying to fit in, right? There's no real super high expectations for this club, which I think as a young player helps you with that advantage, because you can come in and do anything. And if you contribute and if you help, that's great. So ceiling's really, really high for a young player like that. When you look at the experienced side of things, are some experienced players on this roster, whether they're coming in from a different team or they've been there. And I think one of them that we definitely have to highlight is Goodens Daughter. She is a midfielder player, the Icelandic international. She came at the start of the 2021 season, right before the NWSL championship. So she had the NWSL Challenge Cup, which Orlando did not compete in. But she came in and to this club, and she was able to play games and be a contributor for Mark Skinner. And then as the coaching change happened in the middle of the year for 2021, and Becky Burleigh stepped in as the interim head coach, Goodens Daughter was a consistent factor, and she was one of the most consistent players. She's older. She has a lot of experience, and 33 years old, but she appeared in every single regular season game, which is super impressive for her. And she was such a consistent factor. So her experience taking the team last year through every single match and through the ups and downs that Orlando had with players rotating in throughout the Olympics during the summer, she's remained that constant factor. Can she step up her game just a little bit more? Be that experienced player that controls the midfield, that can bridge the gaps between younger players in Viviana Villacorta and some of the more veteran players in Sydney Leroux and Marta. Goodens Daughter is a midfielder and a player for Orlando that has the experience that can hopefully lean into that and also help Amanda Cromwell, because remember, head coach for the Pride, Amanda Cromwell, this is her first professional season, which changes things. It does. It's a different game. These players only have to focus on their sport. They no longer have class to run to or different social activities that are happening in college. It's just a different beast overall. And we saw that with Becky Burleigh, who was the University of Florida coach for years. She stepped in to coach halfway through the Orlando season. Her biggest change was these are professional and they're women. They show up to practice every day and they want to get better. They know what it's like to train. So I think if Goodens Daughter can be that bridge, be that consistent player, it could be a really, really big year for Goodens Daughter.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think in a off season that saw, yes, a lot of departures, but a lot of those departures be more experienced or veteran level type of players, I think was also very significant. So a team like Orlando Pride that is welcoming a lot of new faces into the fold, not just on the player side, but also like really in the administrative level and the coaching side of things. Mm-hmm. There are going to be moments and stretches throughout a long season where you really do lean into and rely on those veteran and experienced players. And I absolutely am in agreement that Goodens Daughter Daughter is going to be one of those players. I mean, she was nearly a player of that caliber last year. She was somebody who was absolutely in the mix of almost competing for an Iron Woman title with Orlando Pride, playing in that midfield week in and week out and down the stretch as the Pride sort of kind of fell out of contention there, kind of getting limited minutes. So I think that's going to ring louder this year in terms of her position in the midfield and for this team in regards to leadership. But in terms of looking at this team and this sort of rebuild that we're looking at for them, we're also going to be looking for players who are going to try to take that next step.
Mm-hmm.
Players that we want to see take it to the next level. And I think when we're looking at this sort of category of player, I'm keeping my eye on Courtney Peterson for this one. This is a young defender for Orlando Pride who joined the team fairly recently. I think when we're, talking about it, you're talking about joining up with the team in a really tough time in 2020, was only able to get limited minutes, right? Because when we remember 2020, it consisted of, the height of the pandemic, the inaugural Challenge Cup, right? Which Orlando unfortunately was unable to participate in and really only be able to get in a little bit of fall series. And so getting a real look at Courtney Peterson and who she is and what she can bring to Orlando Pride during this 2021 season was very impressive. So as a player entering her third year in the league, I think that we're going to keep an eye on a player like this to sort of keep that pace going, right? Keep that development going. And now she's going to be doing this alongside a new coaching staff, right? Versus the old coaching staff with Mark Skinner and company who brought her into the fold. So I'm looking for Courtney Peterson to continue her development and take the next step to the next level with Orlando Pride. In terms of an international spotlight, it's a big international year. We're looking at players who are very impactful for their teams, who could possibly be missing some time due to international windows in light of World Cup qualifiers and such. And I think a big one that we're looking at, of course, is somebody like Marta, a player who has very quickly become real. We're talking about faces of this franchise, right? Sort of became an additional face of the franchise. An icon of the game, right? It goes without saying. And I think even with all of sort of the narrative around who the Orlando Pride are going to be on the pitch in 2022, when you have somebody like Marta on your roster, you maybe look at the roster a little bit differently. You're like, oh, okay, well, you've got a legend on your team. So really, how is this going to possibly look? But, in terms of CONMEBOL, in terms of Copa America, qualifiers coming into play, you're talking about a stretch of summertime, right? Peak summertime matches that somebody like a Marta could be missing. And then maybe I'm also even looking at Goodens Daughter as well for this category. Someone who's going to potentially be participating in UEFA qualifiers, and those are coming up very soon, right? In February, but they go and stretch as late into October of this year. So again, a couple of players here who are impactful for the Pride on the pitch for club, but also equally as impactful for their teams on the national team level as well. So there's maybe a moment where we can't necessarily nail down a starting 11, but I like that we've got a handful of players that we can sort of maybe highlight and chat a little bit about in terms of the season to come for this team. But I think with all of this, there's been these questions, right, around this Orlando Pride team as they enter 2022. And I think one of the biggest burning questions for us as this team officially steps into the 2022 season is, will they actually lean into their rebuild? There has been a number of times where maybe that word has been viewed as a negative, right? It sort of has this perception as if, there isn't going to be anything impactful or inciting that's happening with a team that's in the middle of a rebuild. But I don't feel that way about this Orlando Pride team. I want to see them lean into a rebuild with enthusiasm and with excitement. And my hope is by that extension of that, their fans, their community in Orlando will rally behind that. There's a lot of young prospects here to keep an eye on. And while we did highlight a player like Viviana Villacorta, there's a number of others, right, who are within that as well. And highlighting Courtney Peterson as that next level, next step player is, again, just one of many. I mean, we're talking about players making their arrival to an Orlando Pride team that are NWSL experienced level players like Darian Jenkins.
Yeah.
At this point, a player like Leah Pruitt. They are rejoining another club in their professional careers. And you have to believe that they are probably excited to get in the mix of a team that is an established franchise, but is still trying to conceptually build something new. So that's my biggest burning question for this team going into 2022. Is it a rebuild? Lean into it.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I think if they do lean into it, it's almost like when you have to go to that family party that you don't really want to go to, and who are you going to talk to, and it's going to be awkward and uncomfortable, and can you leave early? Like, they have the 2022 season ahead of them. Go into this season with maybe like minimal expectations. And I mean that in like a very positive way, in like, okay, how can we rebuild? How can we try different formations and different players in different positions and different player personnel combinations on the field? Lean into that. Go for all the different dips at the snack table and try them all on one pretzel. See what works really well. Just lean into it as much as they can. And at the end of the season, I mean, it's almost like looking back to 2021 at the end of that regular season, Kansas City, the expansion club for last season, they leaned into their last place finish for the 2021 year. And they kind of wiped their slate clean and said, okay, let's just go out there and win the games that we can. And they played spoiler at the end of the season. Not that Orlando is there by any means, but can they just go in every single day and try to get something out of that day, no matter what it can be? And you're right. It's if they can lean into this rebuild. I know you mentioned the starting 11. I can't give you one right now. There are so many holes in it. And I want Amanda Cromwell, head coach of the Pride, to use that and try to move players around. Even Marta, throw her in a different position, right? Like, try her out on the wing, not in the center mid, or drop her back a little deeper and see if she can create moving forward with the ball. Just try out a lot of different things and use this year to your advantage, because they are an established club. They're not going anywhere. They have an MLS affiliate. So use this year to just get better and grow the game for some younger, inexperienced players.
It's preseason, right? It's like, that's what it's for. Try some stuff. It's preseason. Yeah. Let's see what happens there in terms of a projected finish, right? This is always the fun part of the episode where we know we get to revisit and see how wrong we were. When we look back into our attacking third way too early power rankings, we did have Orlando Pride placed last in those rankings. And I'm not going to front everybody, witnessing the offseason that took place, a lot of some of the chaos, the biggest acquisition being at this point, lots of allocation money, right? I think we're going to stay in that category. I think maybe be ambitious for Orlando Pride and say that perhaps maybe give them a range somewhere from the 9 to 12 place. There are 2 expansion clubs coming into the fold, and it has history has shown us that expansion sides tend to struggle a little bit to gain their footing in NWSL as things kick off. So there are 2 other teams to maybe contend for that kind of bottom place, but there's going to be some things that this team has to work on moving forward. And I don't think it's unfair to put a number this early in the year. And I would love to come back and talk about it and be proven wrong. I mean, that's our other favorite part of this, besides talking about defenders and goalkeepers and stuff like that.
It really is. And when you look at just Orlando Pride and all that they've lost, yeah, I'm going to put them in that 9 to 12 range. We put them at 12 in December, but literally last in the league for 2022. But giving them the 9 to 12 range is better, because we have to take into account the other 11 teams in this league for 2022. And there are 2 expansion sides that there are so many unknowns between Angel City and San Diego Wave FC. And we've already done a number of these previews with North Carolina and Gotham and Portland. And North Carolina is another team that Sean Nahas is not calling it a rebuild year. But they've lost a lot of parts too. We didn't rate them that high. We put them just out of playoff contention. So that also throws a wrench in Orlando's plan for 2022 and vice versa. Orlando could play spoiler to North Carolina and kind of duke it out towards the end of it. But for 2022, it's towards the bottom of the league. This is a rebuild year for Orlando Pride. Can they lean into that and push for that 9th spot, not the 12th spot, right? It's every little point that counts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, no one's trying to come on here and act like they're not going to compete. I think early in the season in 2021, Orlando Pride came out on this ridiculous, 7-game undefeated streak, right? To sort of start off the season. And then unfortunately their season just took a bit of a tailspin coming out of the summer and then down into the stretch of the final months of the season. And while Sydney Leroux is a very talented forward, you cannot expect one player to kind of save your season, right? And we saw that a little bit down the stretch. And while Leroux gave us amazing highlight-worthy goals, late last-minute stoppage time goals, it's a team sport, right? So you got to see that come to light with this team moving forward. And you're talking about a team that was kind of in the middle of playoff discussion until they were pretty much out of it with about 2 weeks to 3 weeks remaining in the season for NWSL. And maybe that's something that they can lean into as well a little bit, that they were part of the mix for an extended period amount of time until they just simply weren't. So we'll see where this team ends up. We want to thank everybody for listening to our Orlando Pride 2022 preview, full team-by-team previews for all 12 clubs in the NWSL coming up. Stay tuned with us. You can drop us your thoughts about Orlando on Twitter at Attacking Third or in the comments if you subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/Attacking Third. But don't go anywhere. We have an exclusive interview with Orlando Pride forward Darian Jenkins right after this quick break.